Historian, futurist, philosopher, prophet, fortune teller, brilliant genius, wise analyst of the present based on the past and projecting into the future. Incredible stuff. All of his works are genius, but this one in particular today, 1931, Man and Technics, Oswald Spengler. Oswald Spengler, his overall analysis is just brilliant. His larger work, inclusive work, The Decline of the West, says so much about civilization, where it comes from, where it is, where it's going. And being the 1930s, what he predicted, so much of it has come to pass. Man and Technics, in particular, as an isolated volume that I just finished reading, is a really great analysis of the difference between cultures. Very politically incorrect, non-woke, anti-woke in our time. All sorts of screaming and hand-wringing about ism archaeobia would take place. But Oswald Spengler understands that there are differences between people. Every individual is different from every other individual. There are differences between men and women, the two sexes. Of course, there are differences by group of where you live, where you grow up, what your basic culture is, your economic status. The idea that national and racial groups are exactly the same or should be to one another is completely irrational, illogical, and just not part of Spengler's worldview. Spengler's analysis deals with the different characters of communities, of groups, and of races. This is not a qualitative judgment. It's a fact that some people like some things and not others. Everybody's got different tastes. Everybody's got different skills. People are better at this, that, or the other thing, and some are not. It's really so obvious and so rational and reasonable, objective reality that it shouldn't even need to be talked about and excused at length, as I have just tried to do, to diffuse some of the hand-wringing insanity out there. People are different. People are unique. There's nothing wrong with that. Spengler looks at different types of cultures in transition. Conservative cultures versus contemporary ones, projects into the future. Some are so conservative that they become regressive cultures. They tend to not grow, adapt, expand their knowledge. They tend not to be inventive, creative. They tend to be very rigid. Some examples of this would be feudal, closed off and isolated Japan, very traditional China, which at one time was ahead of the curve of vis-a-vis Europeans on mechanical and technological things, but really fell behind and forgot that they'd invented some of those things because this society was so conservative, so rigid, so locked into this single way of doing things that it stagnated. The contrast over and against this that Oswald Spengler observes is the Western European culture from the Greeks and the Romans into the northern areas, which he describes as Faustian man. And I really like this because he uses the unusual analogy of Faust, who sold his soul to the devil in order to gain benefits. See, Faustian man is the man that can be creative, inventive, can break from the norm, is able to not just continue in a traditional way, but is able to adapt himself to new technologies and his way of life, to new things and to new thoughts. So Faustian man, rather than the rigid sort of theocratic, even if it's a set of principles and not a deity, this sense of tradition that must carry on unchanging, Faustian man is able to sell his soul in order to go forward, to say, no, we need to change how we're doing this because we're going to embrace the new technology. Now, interestingly, of course, neither of these is the ideal, and this is the chief criticism of Spengler of contemporary civilization at his time that we can clearly see has now developed as he predicted, maybe worse than he predicted. Pardon me. So there is the aspect of new technology is not always good for us. Changing society is not always beneficial. This is the distinction between the conservative and the liberal sort of view of life, not just in the political sense. The ultra-traditionalist society that does not permit change is going nowhere, and it may just keep existing and not destroy itself, but it will ultimately just stagnate and remain the same. A society that is Faustian, that is open to change, can embrace the new technologies, but the danger on this other end of the spectrum is that we change so much that it undermines the character of who we are, which is, he could have been describing the internet or any number of other technologies. But when you look at how we spend our time, what our activities are, how we process things, how we get information, how we share information, everything has been altered by the technology. We did it because we could. We did it because the availability was there. But the Faustian man, the danger of being innovative like that is the danger of changing for no good reason. We're literally at a place where many people bemoan the changes that have been made in our society since Oswald Spengler wrote about this in the 30s. Changes in culture, the breakdown of the family, though we don't have as many children, we don't raise them with traditional values, the TV raises them, now it's the internet and TikTok, and all of this has radically shifted how we look at the world, how we look at ourselves, how we look at each other. Drastic change, and never did we contemplate whether we wanted to make that change. Was it smart to make that change? Because you can build a car that goes 120 miles per hour. Does not mean that it's wise or safe to journey at 120 miles an hour on a regular road, on a regular day, on a regular basis. But we tend to do things because they're there. And so the Faustian man, the danger of that innovation is getting rid of what worked for so long, what is consistent, what is conservative, traditional, what is basically our identity based on values, too abruptly, too quickly, without forethought, and rushing down the path of radical technology. So societies on Earth can be analyzed by this, the traditional societies that remain unchanging, and they can be medieval Japan, they can be feudal China, they can be sub-Saharan Africa with a tribal existence. Wherever you find them, where they're locked into this structure, where this is just what they do, and they tend not to change. Whereas the Faustian culture has been pushing to the extreme. It's the one that within a few hundred years of any point can be found now to be radically different than it was a few hundred years ago. Dangerous and unhealthy, and much more likely to fumble along into some sort of catastrophic disaster to ourselves or to our world, to our region, to our land, to our health, because we just sort of fumble along and keep going down that road regardless of the consequences. And so, of course, it is ultimately its moderation that Oswald Spengler is advocating for, that technology and progress and change can be healthy and good and perhaps inevitable, but they should be done with a forethought, with contemplation, with a plan. Changes to culture and way of life should have something much more organic about them in a spiritual sense than the radical technological shift simply altering how we communicate, how we interact, how our families are structured, how we raise our kids. These sudden and abrupt changes that are unhealthy and dangerous. So you don't want to be so locked into a rigid system that does not allow change, but you also have the danger of Faustian man being the one that literally makes the deal with the devil, that goes too far, that gives away too much for what is gain. And so the moderation, being able to do things in a way that is healthy, in a way that asks, is our ability to do this within the context of our cultural identity, our heritage, our overall health as a group, as a community, as a neighborhood, as a nation, as a people. Almost sort of an almost Amish sort of ethic. There's a misconception among a lot of folks that the Amish are anti-technology, but some of them use little bits of tech here and there, and others think they're hypocritical. But really what they do is they spend time analyzing if they can use this technology without fundamentally changing their way of life. So if it's good to have a motor to run a piece of equipment, but getting rid of your horses would fundamentally change your way of life, you put the motor on the equipment and you pull it with horses. It looks silly to the outsider that doesn't get the principle in play, but it is almost a Spenglerian, it is almost an Oswald Spengler sort of way of looking at things that he would suggest, not necessarily to that extreme conservatism, but it's in the right direction of, let's think about this first. Should we do this? Just because we can doesn't mean we should. How do we do it in a way that doesn't fundamentally change who we are in character? It's a good way to look at the world. Now, on the other hand, Spengler ends up being extremely pessimistic because he sees what has happened with Faustian man and the radical embrace of radical new changes. He is certain and sure that ultimately what happens is our means to produce this technology in the West, in Faustian culture, ends up being shared so broadly that we end up putting ourselves in competition, economic competition for manufacturing, for jobs, for production with people that did not invent the technology, but that we did. And boy, we see this, the diaspora, the spreading and proliferation of the technology, so that now workers in sub-Saharan Africa, in Asia, who begin making less money per hour, are able to produce the things we want using the technology they were taught, while our society in the West continues to break down. And that ultimately, he says, the breakdown means chaos, anarchy, the decay of civilization, and regression. While on the other hand, the traditionalist cultures who have learned some of this technology from us, by their nature being conservative, will be able to maintain it for a while, but ultimately it's not theirs, and they can't take it fully to the next level, that ultimately it will fall into decline, just as at one time China invented the mechanical clock, but then later were mesmerized to see one when shown one by white European visitors. Because you lose this technology when you are not a Faustian culture by principle. So the danger of self-destruction is there with the Faustian culture, but the inevitable slow decay to either to nothingness or to just stagnating, plodding along without any innovation or change is the danger on the other extreme. In the end, at the end of Man and Technics, Spengler likens us to the remains of the Roman soldier found standing guard at Pompeii, that nobody had relieved him, and so he stood there and he stayed at his post while the volcano destroyed him. That ultimately we've gone so far down this road that he believed it was inevitable that all these things would happen, the shift of production to other nations, which has happened, the decay of our own civilization, which has happened, and he ultimately feels it's inevitable that we will witness in time the complete collapse, and then the collapse of the other that is parasitic from Faustian culture. He has a terribly sad and pessimistic view, particularly at the end of Man and Technics and the decline of the West. But it is remarkable, and if you read it all of the specific fine details of things that he observes, how many hundreds of them have come exactly to pass as he predicted. I'm just talking about the broad scheme of things. We see we are right down the road where he anticipated we would be. That's the warning of history, the historian, the prophet, the analyst, the philosopher, Oswald Spengler.